Hello, everybody. Good to see you again. I was like, do I continue singing the intro or no? I've dropped that facade. I'm no longer singing. Hi, good to see you. If we've never met before, my name is Matt Owens. Good to see you. Welcome back to A Cult of Misfits. Did you know that I'm on Instagram? I'm on Twitter. You can listen to my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Alexa devices. You get the idea. If you didn't check out the last episode, I was talking about the forces of chaos. Real fun topic. Talking about potentially demonic forces on the planet, guys. So a lot of chaos going on. So I talk about that and give you my thoughts on the current chaos on the planet, as well as the Anunnaki. And I talk about sort of our origins as a species, because I've really been diving into these ancient civilizations and stuff. So check out the last episode of my podcast, A Cult of Misfits, if you haven't yet. And if you're enjoying it, feel free to follow me. Feel free to share it with other spiritual misfits that you may have in your life. I always hate it when people who create content say, share, like, follow. It's like, yeah, okay, I'll do it if I feel like it. Like, no need to tell me what to do. So just a friendly, just a little friendly reminder that it helps me out if you share and follow. So today I want to talk about setting yourself free. More specifically, how I've set myself free in many ways. I want to talk about Yahweh a little bit more. I talked about it in the last episode, but I want to talk about Yahweh, the Jewish God, and dive in a little bit to Gnostic beliefs and the demiurge and Yaldabaoth. And depending on where things go, there's a good chance I'm going to talk about the pyramids as well. So that's what we have lined up for today. I yak all the time about freedom. I'm always trying to be free. Like, stop trying to keep me down. I need to be free. I'm a free bird. But I realized at some point that most of my life I had spent locked up in a bunch of cages, and cages and prisons of my own construction, by the way. And I didn't realize that at the time. But looking back at older versions of myself, I can see that poor schmuck. I love him, but that poor guy was trapped in a bunch of prisons, and he just didn't know it. Like if somebody had told younger Matt Owens that he was in a bunch of prisons, he wouldn't have known what you were talking about. He would have said, "What do you mean? I'm totally free." It's this illusion of freedom that we have, perhaps, right? This story that we've told ourselves. But when you see it from a higher perspective, a different perspective, right? You see that there's all these prisons, and what I'm talking about is like prisons of self-doubt, prisons of addiction, prisons of lack of self-worth, just all these cages that I put myself in of fear, essentially, is what we're talking about here, right? I was in this giant cage named fear, and I imagine like this giant ring, like a janitor's key ring, where you've got like 500 different keys on this this giant key ring. How come only janitors sport that thing, by the way? Like, can we start to normalize wearing giant key rings? I'm fashion forward, guys, so I think I'm starting a trend here. So go with it. Don't be surprised if in a couple, like next season, you start seeing the big key ring. That's me. That's my influence on the world, guys. But I see that we have all of these keys that can set ourselves free from all of these cages that I've found myself in. But I didn't realize it the whole time. But the key for me, how many times am I going to say the word key in this? Let's play a little drinking game, guys. Drink responsibly, please. Okay, I can't be responsible for your over drinking and my overuse of the word key. Like, be responsible for yourself. I started realizing that the way to set myself free is to face my fears. That's the bottom line. I'm distracted by this frog outside, so it's croaking loudly. If your spirit animal is a frog, or maybe even if you just believe in reptilian shapeshifters, somebody's saying hello to you right now. The frog just wants to chime in for a minute. So I realized that I had to set myself free because I was pretty miserable in these cages. And I realized that the way out was to start facing these fears of mine. And once I started doing that, it felt like a cheat code, to be honest with you. That's why I work through this stuff in these mediums and telling you these stories about how I'm working through this shit, is because in many ways I feel like I found these cheat codes, right? And I'm like, hey, I found this path over here, like didn't know that it even existed, but here I am on this path. And it turns out when you go down this road and face certain things, you suddenly feel a little bit less anxious all the time. So I don't know if it'll work for you, but here's what I did. Or, I used to have a lot of self-esteem issues. I used to really hate my body. But I went down this road here and I did A, B, and C, and I don't feel that way anymore. So like, if it works for you, here, take notes, friend. Like, this is what I'm trying to do, is just to share, like, I don't have the answer. All I have is what I've done in my own life, and if you want to follow me, like, help yourself. That's what I'm sort of, what I believe that part of my purpose is just sort of sharing this journey of mine, because I know that so many of you are on similar journeys, or at least experience similar things to what I have. And I just want to pass along the cheat codes. I talk about ancient societies a lot, and a lot of these societies, like ancient Greece and the Egyptians, etc., had these mystery schools where they sort of passed along this ancient knowledge, just about the nature of the universe, but also it had a lot of real good nuggets about how to live your life in a more peaceful manner, right? or these ancient Asian philosophies, right? These Asian religions that talk about just not just how to reach enlightenment, but how to just how to find more peace in your life, more joy in your life, right? And I feel that as I've faced my fears, and when I've addressed these issues of lack of self-worth, or um, addiction or imbalance, or whatever the case may be, right? I feel that once I face these things and address them, and ultimately what I'm doing is integrating them and loving them into my system, into who I am, right? Rather than pushing them away or ignoring them. I'm this process of exploring with this key rings that I have, is to unlock these doors. And I found that when I unlock these doors and set myself free, it's like, holy shit, what took me so long to figure that out? Like, life is significantly better now that I've freed myself from that cage. And so that's sort of what I'm sharing here with you all, is those of you who are on a similar journey, these are the things that I do. So and it's not to say that once you free yourself, that it's not easy to, like, maybe go back into that cage, because often that's our comfort zone, right? Where we look at the situation, it's like, you're in a cage, like, what the hell are you doing? And you're like, well, it's all I've ever known, right? I kind of just feel comfortable here. It's kind of scary out there outside of the cage, because I've never been outside of the cage before. That feels weird and scary and uncomfortable for me. But I had a deeper knowing in my heart that once I ventured outside of the cage, once I started, heading towards this freedom, that it would get easier, that I would get used to it, that I would acclimate to life outside of the cage. And it turns out it's a lot better. It's more expansive outside of the cage, right? Not to have to make yourself small, but to fully embrace who you are. It feels good to stretch out, right? And so I've really been enjoying freeing myself. And when I start to feel myself going back into a cage, or start like, because of fear shrinking myself back into that cage again, there's various methods that I use, right? Meditation is huge, huge, huge for me in terms of this, just to remind myself of how strong I am, remind myself that I can do anything, remind myself that this is just a fear. It doesn't have to overtake us. It doesn't have to imprison us. It is not stronger than us. I am not my fear. I'm in charge around here, not you. These are the types of conversations that I have with myself that get me back to balance, that get me back to zero, that get me back to a place of owning my power again, not shrinking away in fear. And there's no shame in the shrinking away in fear. That's a part of this grand adventure that we found ourselves in. But for me, it's about not letting those fears overtake my life, right? Because my whole life, they were in charge. my fears, my insecurities, all of that was definitely running the show because I was letting it, I was allowing it to. It's not that it's more powerful than I am. I believe that I am divinity itself in human form, as are you, as are the table and the chairs and the grass and the wind. But for so long, I've thought that I was this human living in America named Matt Owens, and he got really bad social anxiety, and he didn't know how to deal with his addictions, and he got real jealous all the time and got real angry at certain things all the time and had a real huge ego. I'm not that guy anymore. I thought that I was that character, but I realized I'm so much more than that. That I am an aspect of God. And I didn't start this pattern of thinking overnight. It was a lot of work, a lot of exercise, a lot of practice, a lot of baby steps, a lot of tears. Let's just be real. But it was this path of expansion for me, this path of growth, of figuring out, like, who am I? What does that even mean? What am I truly deep down inside? What I'm saying is, what is my soul? Who is this thing that I am, right? This eternal being living out this grand adventure. I think a lot about God. I think a lot about our origins. I think a lot about how we came to be. All of this stuff fascinates me endlessly, which is what I've been diving into lately. Yahweh is the God of old, the God in the Old Testament, the God that had a bit of an anger problem, was real wrathful, real jealous, perhaps had some anger issues, like had a murderous rage often. This is Yahweh. Let me introduce you to Yahweh, the God of old. If you didn't follow this guy's rules, you were in big trouble. Now, the ancient Gnostics, Gnosticism is just sort of this umbrella term for early Christian beliefs, right? Before Constantine and the Council of Nicaea, before they all kind of got together and had a little powwow and said, okay, we got all these scriptures that are floating around willy-nilly, and we need to start to control the narrative here. So what we're going to do is, we like these books because it sort of goes with the story we want to tell. This is the version of Jesus that we like. All of the versions of Jesus that talk about how when Jesus was a child, he would kill his teachers anytime they upset him. He would kill children on the beach that toppled over his sandcastle, this sort of thing. These are actual ancient stories that talk about Jesus, but they said, no, those don't go with the narrative we're trying to tell. So let's ignore those. And then they picked the books that they wanted, and voila, you have the New Testament. It's heavily edited. It's often plagiarized from past civilizations. I know that that's a scandalous thing to say, and that may upset certain people, but it's just the truth. When you start looking into these ancient stories and myths, even the story of Jesus himself is, I started looking into that one day. I was like, hold on, because I'm in this mode of constantly just questioning everything. Right. I think it's healthy. I think it's healthy to examine things and look at it, um, and to come to my own conclusions once I analyze it. So I thought, like, well, is Jesus even real? Like, that never occurred to me even ask that question growing up in a Christian household. I thought, like, why would I ever question that our Lord and Savior didn't exist? That's absurd. But once I started looking into it, I was like, oh, that's a thing. He may not have actually been a real person. Um, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that points to it, if you're interested. There's ancient Egyptian stories and these Sumerian stories from ancient Mesopotamia, which is to say, where civilization started, according to mainstream scholarships that talk about how civilization started in Iran and Iraq. So you have these ancient stories, of these deities that died 3 days later rose from the dead and then ascended to heaven. Well, that sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? There's another God that had 12, many gods that had 12 disciples. There were gods that had stories of walking on water. They had, just you go down the line, virgin births, 3 wise beings coming and visiting the newborn, king. Like all of these, all of these stories, all of these stories came about thousands of years before the story of Jesus came around in the New Testament. And I didn't know that. And perhaps you didn't know that either. So I just find it an interesting coincidence that all of these things that make up the core of who Jesus is, like, his birthday is on December 25th. That's from ancient Sumerian. That's from ancient Egyptian gods that also have the same thing. It's revolved around the winter solstice and all of these things. So that is to say that there are a bunch of books that were left out of the canonical, King James Bible situation, right? There are a lot of books that the ancient, I keep using the word ancient, but these weren't that ancient actually. This is around 100 AD. But the early Christians were definitely reading these scriptures that were left out. So that's who the Gnostics were. There's just sort of this umbrella term for people who don't take the Bible literally and who, anybody who is not a Christian basically is sort of lumped into this term of Gnostic because they believe the old scriptures. They read the old stuff that was excluded from the Bible. So these folks, the Gnostics, I could make this many episodes, which now that I'm talking about it, I probably will, but fascinating what they believe. But they believe that Yahweh is, they also call Yahweh, this Hebrew God of the Old Testament, the demiurge or Yaldabaoth. So look up that more deeply if you're interested. But the story sort of goes broadly that that Yaldabaoth was this being that was an abomination. He shouldn't have been born. He was an accident. He was this freak abomination that created the material world, much to the chagrin of the higher gods, of Sophia, who birthed. Sophia is an emanation of the all that is that birthed this abomination that is known as the demiurge or Yaldabaoth or Yahweh. And so they believed, these Gnostics, these Christians believed that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, but also this was the God of the Jewish faith as well, right? That predated Christianity. So it was essentially saying that this God that the Jewish people have been worshiping this whole time is this abomination known as the demiurge, which of course was highly offensive to, to the Jewish people at the time, right? And perhaps even still today. But the insinuation is that Yahweh is a false god, and he thinks that he is a god, incorrectly so, and has this group of followers and says, "You need to follow me, Hebrews, Jewish people. I insist that you follow me. If you worship any other god, I'm going to kill you. Here's a list of my rules that you need to follow. If you don't worship me, you're dead. If you do the rules wrong, you're dead. If you don't listen to me, you're dead." So it doesn't paint this picture of a loving, kind, forgiving deity. It's quite the opposite. If you look at the Old Testament, it sort of alludes to that. So it's interesting to think that perhaps this is not the one true God. And if you look at the New Testament, Jesus doesn't talk about Yahweh at all. There are allusions to Yahweh, but Jesus is not talking about Yahweh in a good way, essentially, if you choose to interpret it that way. But there's no mention of Yahweh at all. The only God that Jesus talks about, he calls Father. Abba is the Greek translation, right? And so there's this talk. That's when you start to talk about a God that's loving and forgiving and peaceful and etc. That's the God that Jesus is talking about. And Jesus talks about anybody that was worshiping the old God, Yahweh, are confused. They're worshiping the false God. So controversial, to say the least, right? Because it sort of shakes the foundations of entire religions. But I find it interesting. And, in the previous episode, if you haven't listened to it, check it out. I talk about the Anunnaki. And in many of these ancient scriptures and tales, including Genesis and the Bible, they talk about these beings coming down from the heavens. They talk about beings coming down from the heavens. They all have various names, so as to not confuse, we'll just call them beings that were supposed to watch over us, came down to the earth, started sleeping around with the earth ladies, and creating these monster children, basically. And so I'm curious if Yahweh was one of these beings. Perhaps Anunnaki is what I'm getting at. In the Sumerian text, they call these beings Anunnaki. And so I'm curious, the ancient texts talk about how these gods had their own regions and kingdoms and ruled over them, and had these, godlike powers. And so I'm curious if Yahweh just happened to be one of these Anunnaki that was down on the earth. The ancient texts talk about how the gods lived amongst us. And so if you take that literally, that perhaps Yahweh was an actual being that, was a little above his station, or whatever the saying is, that like got a little too big for his britches and thought he was mightier than perhaps he was. Um, and so I like to look at all of these ancient stories and compare them, because so often there's just so many similarities that just sort of boggles the mind, because allegedly these ancient civilizations never had any contact with each other, and yet they keep talking about the same things over and over again, just calling it a different name in their region. But it's got the same structure as the stories over in Africa or Turkey or Sumeria or anywhere in Asia or the Americas. Like, they all have the same story. Very interesting. So I've really been diving into the pyramids as well lately, which is endlessly fascinating to me. And like I've said before, I never really looked into the pyramids that much. They kind of interested me. And, I've been to a museum that had like actual mummies, and it's just kind of fascinating to look at that sort of stuff. But I never really dug into the weirdness and the mysteries that have surrounded the pyramids for so long, other than like, yeah, I know it doesn't really make sense, and maybe the slaves created them, and I know there's weird mathematics stuff that I don't really understand, and maybe it was aliens, maybe it wasn't. Like, I don't know. It's weird and interesting, right? And I never went beyond that. But lately, I have been diving into it, and there is a lot of weirdness, and that's what I want. That's what I want to talk about. First of all, I won't dive too deep, but I think that the ancient pyramids, along with these other megalithic structures, the giant stone creations that are sprinkled all over the world. That's also interesting, right? And most of them are pyramid shaped ish, more or less. Um, and so I think that there was a great flood 12,000 years ago, a literal actual flood, a cataclysm that wiped out most of civilization. I think that ancient Atlantis was a part of that, and now it's underwater. I think it's either, Bimini Road, in the Caribbean or whatever. And there's also the Eye of the Sahara, which is interesting. If you want to look that up, that's a potential spot for Atlantis, and where it could have been before the flood. But I won't dive into that today, but it is an interesting topic. Atlantis and all that stuff, and Plato talking about it, etc. But um, the pyramid stuff is super weird. And let's just talk about the Great Pyramid in Giza, okay? There are 2.5 million stones, okay? Just let that settle in for a minute. That's kind of insane. Even if there was an entire force of slaves doing it, that's an enormous feat. It's, I would say, nearly impossible, but let's just pretend that that's how it happened. Mainstream science, for those of you that don't know, say that the pyramids were built by slaves in order to be, tombs for the pharaohs, which there's not a lot of evidence supporting that, but that slaves created them by rolling these giant slabs of stone that weighed 30 to 80 tons. This is like, the size of like a locomotive or an army tank or something along those lines, right? So it's moving these stones that are the size of an army tank, rolling them on logs across the sand, um, or putting them in a boat. But the people of that time did not know how to make boats good enough to handle these stones. These are very primitive people. That's what doesn't make any sense. Is these are extremely primitive people that are using stone tools and bronze tools, maybe copper tools. But just the transportation of these stones alone doesn't make any sense, especially when you start thinking there's 2.5 million stones and they came from a quarry that was 300 to 500 miles away. It doesn't make any sense. They didn't have the technology or the knowledge to make boats that could carry stones like this, so that's scratched out. Rolling these things on logs one at a time from a quarry 300 miles away with a bunch of slaves, again, it doesn't really seem feasible at all, actually. But let's just talk about how maybe that's how it worked. Okay, that's just the transportation of these frickin' stones. In some places around the world, outside of Giza, there are up to 1,000-ton stones, which I don't even know what weighs that much. It's this insane size and weight from quarries, 200 miles away or whatever still. So it's like, it doesn't make sense. So the transportation of these stones alone is a real head scratcher, okay? Now let's talk about the actual cutting of these stones. These stones are cut with like literal laser precision, completely flat and smooth, completely level, like with 99.9% accuracy on all of this stuff. It's completely smooth, complete perfect 90-degree angles. With technology that we can barely do that with today. These are granite stone. Often around the world, it's different stones, but it's often granite stone, which is amongst some of the hardest surfaces on the Mohs scale, the hardness scale around the world. So this is extremely tough stuff. Mainstream scholarship says that these ancient people used chisels to chisel this stuff out, and that doesn't make any sense. Today, if you were to do that in a modern day quarry situation, you would have to do it with a diamond cutting tool to have that amount of precision. And there's no evidence that they had diamond cutting tools, obviously, back then. So it's like, it doesn't make sense how they cut these stones with such precision. Then many of them have these interlocking mechanisms where the stones interlock with each other. It's like, how the hell did they do that? Right? Okay, that's just the cutting of the stones. Now it's like, how do we get these 2.5 million stones and get them up into the shape of a pyramid with like ropes and pulleys is what mainstream science says. But again, I find it real hard to believe. Real hard to believe that they had a system of ropes and pulleys that could pull these 30 to 80-ton stones. We struggle with that today in modern society. I read this article about some museum in California that wanted to purchase a boulder for an art installation. Purchase this, like 30-ton boulder, which is about the same size as these stones for the pyramid. Okay, this boulder was like, whatever, 200 miles away from the art museum. It had to be transported 200 miles. Now, it took 1 year of planning to get this thing in motion. They had to build a very specific vehicle that was the size and length of like 11 18-wheelers or 11 like semi-trucks. Okay, it had like an ungodly amount of wheels on it. It was specially constructed out of metal to like surround it and house this boulder and suspend it and all the things. Nothing like it had ever been built before. It was from the ground up. They had to talk to all of these municipalities and take down power lines and close down roads and freeways, and it was a whole thing. This whole special vehicle that was transporting this stone could only move at a maximum speed of 5 miles per hour, and it took almost 2 weeks to transport it. Okay, this is for one stone. There were 2.5 million for one pyramid alone. Guys, it doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. Okay. Now we can talk about how these ancient pyramids, specifically the pyramids in Giza, but also most of them are aligned very, very specifically and precisely to various, whether it's a star constellation or a specific star or something in the sky, right? It's lined up perfectly with the winter solstice and the summer solstice, and then it gets into the mathematics, which is often over my head, where, like, the circumference of this and the diameter of that is an exact proportion to the diameter of the Earth, and it's an exact proportion from the Earth to the sun and the Earth to the moon, and all of the numbers are exactly perfect, and just all this weird shit, right? The construction of it is so precise it boggles the mind. I mean, you have these shafts and chambers in the Great Pyramids that are so far and deep down, these tunnels, that it's like, how the hell did they do it? A. B, how did they do it when there was no direct sunlight? How did they have a light source to do these things? Modern scholars believe that they had like this elaborate system of mirrors to bounce the light off of the daylight into these chambers and caves so that they could continue their work. It's flimsy and doesn't make sense. Maybe, but probably not. I'm open to all these things, but I never really dug into it. And once you start looking at what mainstream scholars and scientists say, it's sort of like, yeah, okay, I get why you say that, but like, it doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense. So it's so unusual to me that all of these megaliths are around the world, and what mainstream science says about them is that they just sort of learned about math eventually and architectures eventually, and they just sort of gained the knowledge, and then they built the pyramids, which again doesn't make any sense. It appears that they just suddenly learned how to do all of these things to start a civilization. The agriculture, mathematics, engineering, all of the things, right? They just sort of suddenly have the ability to do this. And if you want to follow mainstream science about this, they say that they just slowly over time, over thousands of years, learned about mathematics and engineering and agriculture, etc. But there's zero evidence of any pyramids that were like practice pyramids, right? Where they were kind of getting their shit together and practicing this whole engineering thing, right? You don't see shitty pyramids that was like obviously their first, second, third attempt at this thing, and then they finally nailed it with the Great Pyramid. They don't exist. They just suddenly freaking appear. There's just these pyramids. What actually happens on many of these, they're often built on these sacred sites around the world. Many people think it's, there's these specific energies that are tied in with, Gaia and Mother Earth, but that's another topic. But what you see is there's these pyramids that are perfectly constructed around the world, and often they're buried down deep under sediment or under jungle or underwater or whatever. And what you see is that humans come into the region and try to emulate these monoliths or these pyramids that they see, and they try to build pyramids next to them or often right on top of them. And they're shittier versions. So what you see is there's a perfect version at the very bottom, and then as time goes on, they get shittier and shittier as you go up, 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 up. They just keep building on top, building on top, building on top. And you would think that they would get better and better as their skill and practice, they get better at building these pyramids, but you see the opposite. It appears as if these were built a very long time ago with a technology that we do not understand and have no evidence for. That's the head scratcher. Whether or not they were, interdimensional beings or aliens or human civilization, it doesn't matter. It's fun to talk about them, and I do in other episodes. But it's very interesting. It would appear that these were built a very long time ago, and then there was a great flood that wiped out everything except for a few humans. And the humans that survived eventually started spreading out all over this earth that had been freshly reset. And they started colonizing and gathering around these ancient pyramids, these ancient sites, these perhaps divine sites, right? And so I believe that the civilization that's in ancient Israel, I believe they came upon these pyramids. I do not believe that they built them. And I believe that they tried to emulate it in some way, and it wasn't good enough. They've been using I didn't know this, but I just recently learned that they've been using these pyramids of Giza as a quarry, basically, to steal from the pyramid and build their own shit. There were these beautiful white stones that were around each of the pyramids in Giza, so that they shimmered in the the sunlight, etc. So yeah, it's super interesting. And now I have a desire to go and visit these places, just to see them for myself, because I don't think that you get it until you see it in real life. I mean, you look at the pictures and you're like, yeah, that's nutty, but I just feel like it's a vibe, and I really want to go and check them out someday. Um, and I'm just really curious why they're all over the world and what their function is. And I wonder, I just like to ponder, like, if the creators of those pyramids have perhaps never left, right? Like I talked about in my last episode about, the 1% or the elite or whoever's actually running this place. Perhaps it's the Anunnaki or these beings that, have maybe been here the whole time, right? And for some reason they're, if according to the ancient myth, that they were wiped out. But I think that, what if some of them survived and those are their pyramids and maybe they're going to activate them at some point. So these are the things that I like to ponder about. Like maybe that's part of what the big reveal is going to be, is that these pyramids are going to be activated in some way that our ancient ancestors definitely knew about, and we have since forgotten, slash it has been, the all knowledge of it has been burned or destroyed in one way or another. That's why these, it's really interesting that these ancient scripts and manuscripts and stuff that's found in the clay jars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran or whatever, that they were hidden by, a lot of them were hidden by the Gnostics. And speaking of the Gnostics, they were hidden away because it was important knowledge, right? I think that they didn't just consider them myths. I think that there is perhaps some truth to a lot of this stuff. That's what I'm wondering. Like, is this myth or is this real life? Are the Anunnaki just a story, or like, are we going to meet up with them soon? So I'm just really curious about it, because it would appear that the powers that be often cover these things up, literally with earth. You talk. I started diving into Göbekli Tepe, this ancient site that was discovered. Modern science says that the oldest civilization, the earliest civilization, was 6,000 years ago in Sumeria, which is Iran and Iraq. And there's nothing older than that we've found. Well, guess what? We just found a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe that, this is mainstream stuff. This isn't just weird stuff. This is evidence that is 10,000 years old, or more, or older, but at least 10,000 years old. So that's sort of, it's almost double what we currently think civilization started as. And they found these circular structures, these circular stone monolithic structures in Göbekli Tepe, that again are pointing to very specific star systems and, constellations and, heavenly things. But it's very interesting. At Göbekli Tepe, they have these monolithic stones that have these pictographs on them. And it would appear that they're warning about, a great cataclysm that wiped everything out, or perhaps will again wipe everything out. It appears to be like a meteor or something. And it's really interesting. And I can't remember all the details. I should look it up again because it's so interesting. But it appears that there's a warning. It appears that I think that it's a warning of a great flood. There's also all of these specific dates. It makes me think that, like, if we knew that a cataclysm was coming or had come, I think that we would try to find a way through, stone carvings to let future versions of ourselves know, like, hey, here's what happened, and here's a heads up about maybe how to avoid this next time, because here's what we did, or here's what happened. So I think that maybe there's a bit of warning in some of those ancient sites that are telling a story, so that we can be cautious of it again in the future. And perhaps that, there's these ancient stories in the Bible as well about how the gods don't want us to have certain knowledge. And I wonder if the powers that be tried to scrub some of this stuff from history, because they don't want us to know about it for future versions. Um, I talk about the Great Reset. I talked about it in the last episode in more depth, but I just think that I think we're on the cusp of a reset here, friends. I don't say it from a place of fear, but I know that there's so many patterns in this world that we found ourselves in, right? There's all these patterns and cycles, natural patterns and cycles, and of Mother Earth, and of heating and cooling, and, there's a lot of mainstream scientific evidence that the poles shift on this planet, geologically speaking, all the time, regularly and frequently, geologically speaking. And depending on what research you're looking into, like we're many say that we're overdue for a pole flip, which would be devastating for civilization. But I think that's just I feel like there's a reset mechanism on this planet that we maybe can't avoid. Right? Maybe that's not meant to happen. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe we are meant to finally break this cycle and this pattern of destruction, mass destruction on the planet, and maybe finally we escape, and maybe we are meant to go to other worlds to colonize these other places, the moon or Mars or further and beyond. Maybe we were not the original inhabitants of this planet. Maybe the original inhabitants of this planet are still here, and maybe they want us out of here. There's so much that we don't know about our history, and for me, everything's on the table, and I'm reticent, never used that word before, but I feel fancy saying it. I'm reticent to dismiss any theory, because at the end of the day, like we don't know what the hell's going on around here. There's evidence, and there's theories, and there's like, well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's evidence for this or evidence for that. But like at the end of the day, nobody knows what the hell's going on around here, myself included. I don't pretend to. Anybody that pretends to know what's going on, like, I don't believe that guy for a minute. You're a charlatan, sir. It's okay to have beliefs. It's okay to, take evidence and come to your own conclusions. I'm not saying anybody's conclusion is right or wrong. Well, I'm just here to make my own conclusions and talk to you about them and bounce ideas. And I love listening to other people's opinions. I love hearing other people's perspectives, because it's like, I never thought of that before. That's interesting. That goes really well with my beliefs regarding this or that. And this is what the sharing of knowledge is. That's why I enjoy having these conversations. That's why I enjoy listening to endless podcasts about what could be in terms of our creation, or in terms of aliens, or in terms of interdimensional beings, or in terms of God, or any of those things. It's just about sharing knowledge, which the gods don't like us to do, but that's what we're doing. Is saying, well, what do you think about the afterlife? What do you think about this whole alien thing, or Anunnaki, or interdimensional beings, or any of the pyramids? Like, what do you think is going on around here? Because there's definitely, I think, a suppression of a lot of this information, a lot of not just the pyramids, but just esoteric knowledge, and the use of psychedelics being banned in most places in the world. And there's just a suppression of knowledge, a suppression of exploring beyond this, earthly realm, this island, this bubble that we found ourselves in. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and maybe we'll never find them, at least maybe not in this lifetime, right? Wink. But I wonder if all of this is just a construction, if all of this is just a grand illusion, as much of the ancient philosophy points to that. So it's really interesting to talk about it. Now that I'm talking about it, I think I want to start delving into more of the Gnostic traditions and sharing what I found there, because a lot of the Gnostic traditions inform my current belief system, and how things are going around here. They talk about Yaldabaoth and Yahweh and stuff, but a lot of this ancient magic, and the emerald tablets and hermeticism, which I don't talk about very often, but I do find fascinating. So I want to start diving into things like hermeticism, and the philosopher's stone, and topics like that. Alchemy. So stay tuned as I'm talking about. I'm getting excited talking about those things. So if you're into that sort of thing, feel free to follow me on any of the various platforms I'm on, and we can have these conversations that I enjoy thinking about endlessly and talking about. So um, if you're interested in this sort of thing, share it with a fellow misfit, share it with a fellow weirdo who talks about this sort of thing. Because I don't know about you, but I don't have many people in my real life that I can really dive deep and talk about with this sort of stuff without people looking at you like you're crazy, or roll their eyes, or etc. But I enjoy having these open-minded conversations, because at the end of the day, I don't know what's going on, but I love talking about it. So thank you to those of you that also enjoy these types of conversations. Thank you for following me and listening, and joining in on these topics. And if there's something you'd like me to dive into, or a topic that you'd like to hear my thoughts on, let me know in the comments, because I love diving into new topics, and talking about it here in the podcast. So thanks again for joining me. End transmission.